Okay, I think I'm live again. So, for those who didn't see chaos that just ensued, I went live. I was doing my stream. I was talking about the thing I wanted to talk about, and then this YouTube thing that I barely know how to use crashed on me. But I do think we're back. So, let's get right into it. So there was a big announcement made in the world of music, and particularly in the world of music collecting, in the terms of in the world of music listening, the audiophile world, and that's really where the interesting stuff is going on these days. The mainstream labels, the few that are left, and the few not fully owned by asset management companies, they're content with the streaming world because that's how 99 point umpteenth percent of people are receiving their music. And that's not a bad thing. I've talked about all of the good aspects of streaming before, namely that the world of music, everything just about ever recorded, is available to you at the push of a button. And what we would have given to have that when we were growing up. But of course, the downsides are well known for the artists. They don't get paid as well. And that magic and the mystique of holding something in your hand. So I see the upside and the downside, but enough of that. Let's talk about this new announcement, and let's talk about who it came from. It came from Chad Kassem, and Chad is the founder and CEO of Acoustic Sounds, Analog Productions, and Quality Record Pressings, and a few other companies associated in that wider Acoustic Sounds family of companies. And Chad is one of the most interesting guys in the world of recording and record distribution and music listening altogether. And the people in the sort of audio community, music community, have known about him for decades. He's been doing this informally since the 80s, you can call it, informally since the 90s, if you want to put it that way. But the legacy media, for what they're worth, have actually been noticing him for the first time. And there was a special on the CBS Morning News the other week about Chad. Now, Chad is a fascinating guy for many reasons. He does a job that others wouldn't have the stomach to do, which is, slave away day and night for the benefit of people who love music. But his background is very interesting as well. He was born in southern Louisiana, loved music, loved records. He loved the rock of the day, which was, 70s rock. We now call it classic rock. He loved blues, huge affinity for blues. He loved the traditional Cajun and Creole music of Louisiana, a very interesting and unique form of music, to be sure. And he also was someone who, like many people, fell into the world of drugs. And at one point, a judge said, "You've got two options. You can go to a regular old prison, or we can send you to Salina, Kansas, in the middle of the plains, to a rehab program." And he took that option and he said to his dad, "Just send me my stereo system and my record collection and I'll be okay." And he turned out to be more than okay, because as he got a job as a cook in a kitchen, he kept on buying more and more records. It was what he loved to do more than anything else. And you know what they say, when your collection is big enough, you eventually become a record dealer. And in those days, records were still legal, unlike drugs. It's sort of the opposite now. Go figure. And so he formed his company, Acoustic Sounds, and he was selling these records, mail order, about, this was pre-internet, and he specialized in audiophile records, and the biggest company at the time was Mobile Fidelity Sound Labs, MFSL, which itself has a very interesting story. It was a company that recorded interesting sound effects on location. So a train going by, a waterfall, a thunderstorm, hence the mobile, because they were going places to record these. But in 1979, they became the world's first official audiophile label. And that's just before we get back to Chad, because these two tales are related. And by the way, if you're just interested in the big announcement and you already know this stuff, just fast forward or watch another channel. Freedom is really useful if you know how to use it. So Mobile Fidelity, they were the world's first official audiophile record company. Prior to that, you did have some specialty labels in the world of classical music that were sort of audiophile before the term really entered into the common lexicon. You had things like Everest Records, Records. You had things like, back in the very early days of stereo, Westminster Records. And you had the big labels that had their classical audiophile series. You had RCA Living Stereo, which had both pop and classical, but their classical Shaded Dog and later White Dog Records, legendary, as were their reel-to-reel tapes. Same with Decca SXL in Europe, which is by the same name of London Blueback in America and Canada. Beautiful stuff. Mercury Living Presence, come on, classics. Vanguard classics. But what did this all have in common? They all featured classical music. Mobile Fidelity was the first company to say, we're going to produce audiophile records, but we are going to produce the music of today, the music that is really popular today, or at least a couple years before today. And that was quite revolutionary. And so, for instance, the first record that they released was Supertramp's Crime of the Century. That came out in 79 on Mobile Fidelity. The original came out in 75, just a few years earlier. Then they did Dark Side of the Moon. They did a bunch of Steely Dan records. They did Yes. They did Genesis, King Crimson, not the entire catalogs, but I'm talking about individual records from these companies. They did do a few catalogs. They did all of the Beatles. They did all of Sinatra's Capitol stuff. Wish they did Reprise as well. Lawyers do get in the way. And again, so many great titles. And this spawned many other labels that were doing similar things. You had Nautilus Records, you had Super Disc, you had Sheffield Labs, which actually started before Mobile Fidelity, but they really came to be seen as this, as part of that family post-Mobile Fidelity, because as I said, MoFi, as we call it for short, was the first that really had the music of today that people who were either young or approaching middle age would be interested in at the time. And yes, they did a lot of classical and jazz as well, but it was sort of the mainstream and sometimes progressive rock that really was the lodestone of this company. Now, around 1985, along with the rest of the industry, MoFi shifted from audiophile LPs to audiophile compact discs, because the CD itself, when it came out, it was sold as an audiophile format, not without good reason in many ways. You could technically get more of a dynamic range. It had a no noise floor. It was more convenient. It didn't scuff. It was immune to the elements and all of that. But Chad Kassem, see, I told you I'd weave it back to him. I know how to do a weave. I can weave so well. I'm like a hairstylist. So we're back to Chad. So Chad, as many mavericks do, got into the LP business right when everyone else was getting out of it, including Mobile Fidelity. They got back into it later, but in the mid-'80s, they were cutting back on LP production, and they were starting to focus more and more on compact disc, audiophile compact discs. And so Chad had his mail-order company, and he became very successful because while the industry was saying people wanted fewer LPs and more CDs, particularly among audiophiles of the 80s, Chad saw firsthand that a lot of these audiophile guys still want the audiophile quality LPs. And his business that he ran out of a crummy little apartment eventually became a real fully fledged business. And then in the 90s, he started pressing his own LPs under the name Analog Productions. He came out with all sorts of interesting ones. The Plow That Broke the Plane, conducted by Stokowski. I think it's Virgil Thomas composer, was one of the first. So many other interesting ones. And his company went from strength to strength. Then in the 90s, a lot of people in the audiophile world began to turn away from CDs and back to LPs. So you saw in the mid-90s, Mobile Fidelity, MFSL, MoFi get back into LPs with their Anadisc series. You saw the emergence of Acoustic Sounds Analog Productions, and you saw the emergence of classic records. Now, in the early 2000s, I think it might have been 07, 08, don't quote me on that. Maybe it was 09. It could have even been a few years later. But around then, Chad purchased Classic Records. And that meant he took control of their catalog. And they were doing a lot of rock titles and also a lot of RCA Living Stereo reissues. And since then, Chad's company has gone from strength to strength. They bought a decommissioned church in Salina, Kansas, where the company is based. Chad went to Salina Carolina because the judge told him he had to, and he never left. And that church now functions as a recording studio where Chad continues to record a lot of very classic blues, mainly blues artists, some jazz, some other genres. And it's really Smithsonian worthy audiophile recordings of musicians, many of whom are very old. And he captured their music making on the finest, highest fidelity. He also owns his own record pressing plant now, Quality Record Pressings, really interesting company. And yes, the epilogue of the MoFi story is that, yes, at the end of the 90s, MoFi did go bankrupt, but Jim Davis of Music Direct purchased them along with all of their audio mastering equipment and brought back most of the mastering engineers who had been working at the original company, with the exception of the great Stan Ricker, who really put the company on the map sonically, along with Jack Hunt, another great engineer. But people like Krieg Wunderlich and people like Rob Levert and Sean Britton, they were obviously linkages between the two, the old MoFi and the new. And today, MoFi makes both records and super audio CDs, but controversially to some, ever since around 2015, their records are mastered by super high fidelity DSD as opposed to directly from tape. And that was something of a scandal in this world. Bored yet? Of course you are. So that's for the newbies and the normies, your introduction to that. But let's talk about this new announcement because I find it fascinating, and I'll tell you why. It's called the Rhino 45 RPM Audiophile series. It's a collaboration between Rhino, which owns the master rights to these records, and Analog Productions, Chad's company that will be putting out these records. And what's unique about this series is that it's mostly rock. Now, why is that interesting? Well, the major labels, after decades of not caring about the specialty audiophile world, they realized, hey, why should we license our material that we own? Because, of course, the musician doesn't own anything. Some do, most don't, sadly. Why should we, big record companies, Mr. Sony and Mr. Universal and Mr. Warner with his brother, why should we license this stuff to MoFi and Analog Productions and Impex and all the rest of it when we can put it out ourselves? And realizing that in general, rock titles still they tend to sell more even now than jazz or classical. Why not do it ourselves? And so that's made it more difficult, not impossible by any means, but more difficult for a lot of these specialty labels to get licenses from these record companies to do rock titles. And so the fact that these are all rock titles is quite interesting. And it's sort of a follow-up from what Chad has been doing for the last several years, which is the Atlantic 75 series, where records that were originally distributed by Atlantic in America are now coming out on Analog Productions. That series had a lot of delays that were beyond their control, but that series is almost wrapped up. And so this new series, it features records that were originally on a variety of labels like Atco, Chrysalis, Atlantic, Reprise, all of which are now owned by Rhino, which is, I do believe, a subsidiary of Warner. A lot of corporate alphabet soup there. But let me just read you through some of these titles. There's Van Morrison's Moondance, there's Astral Weeks, Foghat, self-titled, the first two albums by America, great band there. You've got the Graham Parsons debut, you've got Sundown by Gordon Lightfoot, you've got Breezin', great jazz fusion album by George Benson, a lot of Jethro Tull, War Child, Minstrel in the Gallery, Songs from the Woods, and Heavy Horses. You've got the Breakthrough album by Casey and the Sunshine Band. You've got the first Montrose album. You've got Fire on the Bayou from the Meters, which is an absolutely great album, and I think another one from the Meters as well is in there. You've got the Ramones self-titled, not necessarily an audiophile album, so that's a bit unexpected. You've got Diamond Girl and Summer Breeze, two of the finest albums from one of my favorite groups, Seals and Crofts, and perhaps most interestingly, two Genesis albums that I think could really benefit from the audio treatment, Duke and Wind and Weathering. Wind and Weathering is particularly interesting because even the original pressings, whether on LP or later on CD, they were quite bass shy. And so it'll be interesting to see what's on that master tape and what isn't, and what decisions the engineer makes. Most of these are going to apparently be mastered by a great young engineer, and by the name of Matthew Luthans. Wonderful, wonderfully talented and nice guy. Some other engineers will probably be involved too. They haven't named names, but if other series from Acoustic Sounds Analog Productions are any indication, it's probably going to be Kevin Gray and Chris Bellman, two of the finest in the business. And so I'm looking forward to this series, although there are some questions. Is it just going to be 45 RPM LP, or is it going to also have an accompanying super audio CD, the pinnacle of digital sound, direct stream digital, which most people argue is better than the traditional pulse code modulation digital associated with the vast majority of all digital sound right from the beginning? So that's a question that I hope Chad can address shortly. And that's another thing I like about Chad. Unlike the presidents and CEOs of other companies, he's very interactive with his fans and clients. He puts out videos talking casually about what he's up to. He's been doing live listening events at various hi-fi shops. He's been, like I said, in New York City. He's actually having a big sort of festival to celebrate the, I think, 40th anniversary of Acoustic Sounds in Salina, Kansas in October of 2026. So if we haven't collectively blown ourselves up by then, it should be a whale of a time on the plains there. And so hopefully he can do SACDs of this. But again, if he's unable to, it's probably the fault of Warner and Rhino, not him. Because the licensing agreements that the record companies are churning out are increasingly limiting. And like I said, it's because these companies have learned that if they hire a great mastering engineer like Kevin Gray or Ryan K. Smith or Chris Bellman or Matt Luthans, they can release high quality, high fidelity product themselves, whether on LP or Blu-ray, which for the mainstream record companies is more preferred than the super audio CD, even though it's ultra high quality PCM. Not many people can tell the difference between PCM and DST, but there you go. And so that's one of the reasons that maybe there's no SACDs. And people might ask, well, what's the deal with 45 RPM LPs? Because for a lot of people out there in Radio Land, you may not have ever heard of this. 45 RPM, obviously, historically, the speed at which a single would turn. Most of these were 7-inch singles, but then in the 70s and 80s, you started getting club mixes on 12-inch singles. And the principle, which some disagree with, is that if you have a high quality LP that spins at 45 RPM as opposed to 33 1/3, the fidelity is higher. That's disputed. What isn't disputed is that you have more dead wax at the end of the record. And however good a pressing is, once you get closer to the dead wax, the center of a record, the more difficult it becomes to press a distortion-free piece of sound. And so because of that, you don't have the problem, especially with longer pieces of music, of that distortion coming in once you get towards the end of a side of a record. So that's one advantage of 45 RPM. Obviously, the disadvantage is that LPs that used to be single LPs when they were on 33 are now double LPs. And so people have to get up and flip the record over and sit down. And that is a lot of work for some people because there's a lot of bitching about that. But the reason that so many of the audiophile labels, whether MoFi or Analog Productions, are doing it is because the record labels themselves have become better at monopolizing the 33 1/3 RPM market. And so they'll say, look, we'll let you, the more obscure the format, we'll license it to you people, but for the more standard format, we will do it ourselves. We'll hire the Kevin Grays of the world and we'll do it ourselves. And making matters even funnier, Rhino is now releasing reel to reel, open reel to reel recordings. Reel to reel was always the highest quality format for the home in the analog world. It was how stereophonic sound was introduced in the 50s. It was pretty much, it slowly died throughout the 70s because people found it inconvenient, thread a reel through the tape heads and the pinch roller. And then you have the take up reel and all of these things that people didn't want to do. See, people have always been fundamentally lazy, and people being lazy is very good for inventors because inventors are not lazy, but they make money and they push technology forward by catering to the conveniences of those who are lazy. So never let it be said that lazy people aren't important. If people weren't lazy, you wouldn't actually have an economy. Why invent the electric light? Why invent the automobile? Why invent the elevator? Why invent anything? Well, lazy people are the inventor's best friend. They say necessity is the mother of invention. Maybe, but I think lazy people are the mother of invention. Just us, the AI companies that are allegedly in the midst of a bubble, but that's only because a lot of these companies don't actually have the fundamentals that they claim they have, not because AI is fundamentally not useful to lazy people who, like I said, make the economy go round. And maybe people should get more lazy because the economy is really bad right now. Weird advice, folks, but there you go. How did we get there? Oh, yeah, the licensing agreements and reel to reel. So, yeah, Rhino, for instance, they just came out with the Yes album on reel to reel, an album that wasn't even originally available in that format. Because, like I said, in the 70s, fewer and fewer labels were releasing albums in reel to reel, and most reel to reel albums were classical anyway. Because again, audiophile format. But I think this collaboration between Chad and Rhino is going to be very interesting. Like I said, Wind and Weathering, one of my favorite albums of all time, never had the audiophile treatment. Maybe because the sound on the master tape doesn't have the kind of bass depth we would want. But I have high hopes because whether it's Matt Luthans or one of the other great mastering engineers, it will be in good hands. It will sound as good as it ever could. I just hope they give both an analog LP version, which they are going to do. I hope they also do a DSD digital version as well. Maybe, though, Genesis are going to release the original mixes themselves, and that would mean they wouldn't want a digital version in the hands of a smaller label. Because for those who don't know, in 2007, Genesis remixed their entire catalog, not remastered, remixed. That means they go back to the multi tracks and start from scratch, as if it's the day after the recording sessions finished up. Some people like the remixes, some don't, but while a lot of other bands have done the same, they tend to keep the originals in print and on streaming services. Genesis withdrew them. You cannot buy the original mixes and you cannot stream them unless, of course, you're at a used record shop or on eBay and can get the original CDs, the 94 remastered CDs, or the original LPs. So I think it's more than enough time that Genesis needs to do what other bands have done and say, look, we want people to have remastered versions of our original mixes. Chad is certainly taking care of that on the LP side. He's released a number of SA CDs. I just hope Wind and Weathering and Duke also get their SA CD, but time will tell. So that's the big announcement that a lot of people in the audiophile record collecting music fanatic community have been talking about. They haven't put the complete list of records online yet because Chad has been teasing this announcement at various live events, but I'm sure in a few weeks it will be online and you'll be able to read through the full list of all the titles, even though the Genesis ones I think are kind of the most fascinating because those two albums have long been overdue in their original mix to have an audiophile version. But we shall see. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care. I think we're off now. Is that a charger?